So on today's episode, we're chatting with Alex Renton, an investigative journalist whose work has made waves across some of the UK's biggest publications, including The Independent, The Evening Standard, The Times, and Newsweek. Beyond his award-winning contributions to foreign reporting and investigative journalism, Alex has become a pivotal voice in exposing some of the dark realities behind Britain's elite boarding schools, having gone to Ashdown House in Eton himself. And drawing from his own experiences, his investigative journalism and his work for ITV's Boarding Schools, The Secret Shame, and BBC Radio 4's In Dark Corners has shed light on abuse and systematic cover-ups in prestigious institutions. You'll hear a deep conversation with Alex, who pulls few punches, and I'm glad you're here to listen in. Well, Alex Renton, thank you so much for coming on the Privileged Man podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Alex, you wrote a book called Stiff Upper Lip. Could you give us some context as to how you came to writing that and why?
Well, I suppose it starts when I was 8 years old and I went off to a very traditional boarding school called Ashdown House. Traditional, posh one. David Linney, the Queen's nephew, started the same day as me, and Boris Johnson about 3 years later. And I had the education that my father had, my grandfather had, that 11 generations on my mother's family side had, sent away from home early. As for very many people, it didn't go well. I mean, it was a deliberate act of neglect in order to turn me into a good soldier for the English elite establishment, if you like. And so I went through what many people have been through, which is, that a pretty hideous time of abandonment and fracture of my relationship with the people who actually loved me, and attempts to survive in a very harsh environment. And it was very harsh. I mean, it was very traditional, and it was a very badly run, very self-regarding, arrogant establishment that generally fed children to Eton, which is where I went afterwards. And there was a lot of abuse, psychological, physical, and sexual. So I left, I ended up being a sort of a journalist on national newspapers and some investigative journalist. And so when in 2013, a group of ex-pupils of Ashdown House of the school started a private compensation case against the school for sexual abuse there because they'd failed to get a police investigation. I thought, as a journalist, I know about this. I need to step in. So I wrote a big article in one of the Sunday newspapers, a magazine piece, about what had happened at Ashdown and had happened to me personally, but also a bit about the wider context because I was intrigued. Because I knew, everyone who went through those schools knows the extent of the abuse, psychological and physical, and how silent it was kept. And I was just inundated with mail. And I think because as a survivor and also a journalist, people felt they could confide in me. And it became a full-time job for the next 6 months, just trying to process the incoming and work out ways to help people. And eventually that turned into, clearly I had to write the book. So that was Stiff Upper Lip, which was published, I think, in 2017. And there have been radio series. We're making another one at the moment, actually, and TV documentaries. And I think for me, the good effect for me as a survivor of child abuse in the boarding system is I've been able to turn the energy and the anger, the negative energy and anger from that into something useful, which I can reliably say, unlike most of the things I've done in my life, has helped people. Because the simple fact of being there and ready to hear people's stories and tell them they're not alone, it can be immensely encouraging. Plus, we've got quite a lot of villains banged up, and I hope we've frightened the residential childcare sector a bit into looking after children more seriously, instead of just looking after their reputations, the institution's reputation, which is what clearly was happening at Eton and at Ashdown, my schools.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, when you talk about your own experience, could you give us a little bit of insight into that? And then sort of as you were uncovering, or in 2013 when these stories started to come up, how triggering did you find that for yourself?
I've had a lucky and privileged life. I was never unaware of what had happened to me or in denial about it, which I think a good half or more of the people who write to me have been for most of their life. And people like Joyce Shavarian and Nick Duffel would see me as a very obvious type in the boarding school survivor world. I was a very, very angry teenager, and I really rejected authority. At the age of 14, I decided that adults weren't trustworthy or worth listening to. And this is a result of not just being sexually abused by people who should have been looking after me, but also when I spoke up, I told my mother, and she told the headmaster, and I suffered because of speaking up. So I became, with a child's logic and sense of unfairness, which are very valuable things. I took that into my teenagehood, and so I suppose from that, I got myself expelled from Eton fairly deliberately, and I went through a lot of things which weren't good. But I suppose by my mid-20s, I'd emerged as an anti-establishment person, but someone deeply questioning the authority, and I went into the perfect profession for that, which was investigative journalism. And so it was enormous privilege. So I knew quite early on what had happened and its effect on me. And I talked about it, to girlfriends. And, I was very open about it, in a kind of boastful, hey, look at me way. I went through, a lot of the risk-taking behaviors that people talk about. And I went into therapy really quite early in my late 20s. It wasn't very effective, but so I think that fact of early acknowledgement, which is pretty unusual, was incredibly healthy. I was really lucky. One of the most awful things, as you know, about this is that children don't disclose, average 20 years. And early disclosure and early intervention can sort out a lot of problems. And I think, beyond the sexual abuse, like so many of us, emotionally very torn between the establishment and not the establishment. I have a lot of underlying anger, as people who love me will tell you, and a struggle with a damaged sense of self, which will be with me all my life. But I'm lucky to have acknowledged it and use it, I suppose, in my work.
Absolutely. And have you ever taken on this trait of using humour to bypass much of it?
Of course, that was the training. And actually, I'm one of the things I'm involved in at the moment. I wrote a book about my family's involvement in slavery in the Caribbean.
Right.
And I've been involved in a very complicated committee recently, which is around the Church of England's to pay reparations, to pay for the damage that its involvement in slavery did. And I was told off quite seriously on this committee the other day for I'm always dodging by making jokes. And that is the instinct. And it's, that something my wife, who did not go to boarding school, would say as well.
Well, we have that. We definitely share that.
Cut the gags, stop dodging, get real. I mean, she said to me years ago, I think I wrote this as if upper lip, you gather 5 boarding school kids, male, I don't think the women do it so much, around a table, and they will quite quickly, with a prompt, start capping each other's stories of hilarious horrors that happened. So-and-so who jumped out of a window and so-and-so who this and that, and that sort of one-upmanship way. How horrific and funny can you be? And the other people around the table will sit with their faces just dropping, going, these people are mad.
We see this play out every Wednesday in the House of Commons, don't we?
Yes, to an extent. I mean, yes, possibly. I have very complex feelings about what we went through, not least because I'm not unhappy with the person it made me. Though it could have gone very badly wrong. I mean, I'm happy with who I am now, and the things that my anger about injustice has helped me do as a journalist, and where that's got me in my career and in my sense of self. So my children didn't go to boarding school. I mean, put it that way. But one of the things I think we who question it and are against it have to take on board is clearly, even today, a potentially a very good investment. I mean, if you want, just as in the 19th century, or with my great grandfather, who was a tea merchant and jumped up 3 classes. If you wanted to buy your children a way of getting ahead in the British hierarchy structure, the imperial structure, a place in boarding school is a good investment. Highly risky, we all know, but if it worked out, you could rise to the top. And that remains the case. I mean, the environment is bigger. If boarding ended tomorrow, yeah, of course I'd be happy. But I think we have to see that it did produce exceptional people, exceptionally miserable, exceptionally sad, exceptionally nasty, and also exceptionally successful.
The great conundrum, right? As you say, it's still the case. I wouldn't be sitting here having these conversations with amazing people if I hadn't gone to the school I had, because simply I can access people that otherwise I wouldn't have been able to.
Yes, so that's one of the many advantages. The network, the speaking the same language, the sort of automatic, we understand each other. The problem, of course, is that we don't know what we would have been like if we had ordinary upbringings. You kind of need to A/B test with identical twins and have one stay at home and be loved and go through the state system, and one to actually work it out, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
But that said, because I mean, I'm feeling 1,000 campaigning boarding school survivors breathing down my neck. It is a cruel, vicious system which continues to perpetuate class apartheids in Britain. And it clearly, you can no longer say it made Britain a great country, which was the key defense 50 years ago, because look at Britain today and the mess we're in.
What role do you think boarding school has played in that?
Well, it's just been working on something with a broadcaster about the role of boarding school and empire. It is intriguing where, one of the things is in my book and in other people's books, that just how by the late 19th century and through the 20th, other imperially minded nations went very openly, we need to copy the British system. But how a delegation from communist China came to look at Eton because someone in the Politburo is going, we need to find a better way of training the elite. Khrushchev did the same in the 50s and started boarding schools for elite Soviet children, saying that parents can't be trusted to bring them up properly, which is exactly what 19th century's parents were told in Britain, is that mother's influence would soften the child. Hitler, fascinated by the British boarding school system, sent people to investigate it. The first things we did in the late colonial period, when we started talking about, we did actually have to educate people in these countries that we looted and taken over, was start building British-style schools for the elites of those countries. So it's kind of self-fulfilling. I mean, if you're sitting there at the end of the 19th century going, around the world going, this is clearly the best empire ever, and you're telling yourselves that, then clearly the system by which you produce the officers of the empire must be good. I mean, the Romans presumably felt the same about their system. But is it key to the structures of late imperial Britain? Yeah, totally. It's also key to, more damagingly, I think, to what people have called British exceptionalism. Which I think brings us straight to Brexit and our current troubles in the nation, which is this deeply ingrained belief that Britain is best and will be the best, and whatever course it takes will work out, which comes from all those hundreds of years of failing to recognise the errors. Can you tie that back to the arrogance that was drilled into us in grand public schools? Yeah, I mean, I think you possibly can. The gap between self-belief and arrogance or excessive self-belief is kind of narrow. We don't get anywhere without self-belief and trust in ourselves. But too much of it, hey, Kwasi Kwarteng, Boris Johnson, David Cameron, and you can screw up really badly because you don't have the brakes.
Or the ability to listen, right?
I do have a problem because this is very current in these discussions around boarding school syndrome and so on. And people go, but you were brought up in a way which drilled the empathy out of you, reduced you to a person who only served your peers and the machine, made you cruel and unlistening. But it's not true. There are some like that. There are some who are very different. Yeah, and I think that's always been us. The traditional boarding schools have always produced a rebel element who went out and tried to do exactly the opposite of what they were trained. I mean, chart George Orwell's journey from being Eric Blair, scholarship kid at Eton and at some hideous prep school that he wrote about absolutely brilliantly, through to policeman in Burma, and then one of the earliest critics of the British Empire, not as a political structure, but as a structure of fostering hatred and cruelty, and then into the author of 1984. It's very hard to say boarding school gets the empathy out of people and tells them they don't need to listen to anyone except the people like them. It's an element, but it's provably not universal.
Interesting. It's probably part of my story. My story was that definitely, the Conservatives were right about pretty much everything, and that anything that came out of any other politician's mouth was wrong. And I felt that I was definitely a leader at school in terms of being in the sports, although I ended up being vice captain of everything and never quite made it to captain. But basically, as a result, was feeling as though I was a leader. So I had a real problem with authority when I left school, particularly, and sort of went into sort of corporate atmospheres, and I was sort of being told what to do. But I did have a problem with listening, and I only realized it when I was about 30 and had been doing some sort of personal development work. And I suddenly went, wow, I've literally just been listening to the stories that I was told as I was growing up, and had created beliefs around them. I don't know. For me, that's definitely part of the sort of blinkers that I had on.
I think that listening is a very interesting and important point. I mean, I do. It is a male thing as well. I wanted to develop an app. I decided where you put your phone on the table at a dinner or coffee between four people, and it would just it would record the percentage of the time that each person had spoken.
Right.
And I think we all know how that would pan out.
Right.
Come away from things, and my wife goes, "He never asked me anything. He just talked and talked. Bloody public school boy." I mean, quoting her directly. There is an element of that, but it's kind of interesting because people were saying this from the 60s, going, the Brits are no good being CEOs or running companies. They don't listen. They only believe people who had the same narrow upbringing that they did. And because of their hierarchies, they can't run things. That's why British companies fail and American companies succeed. But then there's this sort of positive confirmation bias going on there, because you can immediately in the end of the 60s or something, just go, okay, GC, rank zero, all the British companies that failed, the grand British companies that did dominate the world and then failed, and go, okay, British management is terrible because of the boarding school, the public school system. And then you go, but there's always another side. I think it's easy to prove. I do buy the argument that our educational apartheid here, and I live in a city, Edinburgh, where 25% of children are in private education, is disastrous for the country more generally. We have really bad educational achievement statistics across the whole country. And countries like Sweden or Finland or Germany with very little private education have far, far better. So for me, in terms of a healthy modern Britain, those larger things are more important. I think private education is a brake on our society. It's not good. And we have to look at failing Britain today and ask for any proof at all that the private system, including the boarding system, has been good for this nation. I'm not sure it has.
Yeah, just pick up on this theme of failing Britain. That is what I wanted to sort of pull out of this talk today, is that the stiff upper lip and this sort of denial that comes from the echelons of Parliament is just that it just feels like denial. The last time we were in more debt was just after the Second World War. The time where taxes were this high was, again, just after, say 50 years ago, 60 years ago. There's a lot of social unrest. There's a lot of disconnection within society. But yet, if you were to go and look at, as I say, Prime Minister's Question Time and see them talking, there is this sense of just complete disconnection to actually what most people are feeling. I feel, and my mission is to take that part of that sense of disconnection, that sense of total denial, untruth, and suck it out and actually tell people, look, actually, this is all happening and we actually all need to come together to fix it, rather than keep going down this line of it's that group's problem and it's that group's fault. And I feel, coming back to the stiff upper lip line, that is the part that is actually ultimately what that American guy was actually talking about. Is this sense of just, keep calm and carry on. That's okay for the elite, but it's not okay for 99% of the rest.
Yes, it's okay if you've got a gîte in Provence and a few 100,000 in an offshore account, or a few million in an offshore account. Are these British problems alone? I think you kind of have to ask that. I think Parliament is a mess. Democracy is clearly not working properly in Britain, as in so many other places. I'm not sure PMQs, that's just the face of a part of the system which seems to be designed for entertainment rather than for actually running things. I mean, my dad was a Conservative MP and a minister under Margaret Thatcher, but he wouldn't be a Tory now. I mean, he's an old Etonian. He was far to the left of anyone in the Tory party now. If he was sitting here, he'd say 5 or 6 of my generation that came out of Eton just after the Second World War became Labour MPs. Attlee's revolutionary government, the only revolutionary government we've had in the last 150 years, the Labour government that came in 1945, nationalised healthcare, everything else, half of them were public schoolboys. So I think that you went to public school, you become a Tory isn't automatic. It's much truer now. There's no Etonian Labour MPs or Lib Dem MPs now, which is kind of interesting and weird. I do think, in the end, this educational problem we have and we've inherited and our lack of understanding about what good education is, that's very much a part. If you have systems run by people who went through private education, then why should they get it? That's part of dealing with the larger inequalities in the country generally. See, the other thing my dad would say, and he did say, my generation left Eton and then Oxford and went into... He was a banker for 10 years, but then he became an MP. And he said, we became lawyers, we became judges, we became doctors, we joined the carrying profession and so on. Everyone who left Eton from your generation went straight into the city to make money. What happened to an idea? And this is clear in the sort of 19th century writings about the ethos of the boarding schools, is that you took this great gift of your privilege, this amazing education you'd got, making you one of the best people in the world, and used it for the common good.
Right.
Really interesting how all my contemporaries who completed Eton and Oxford, they really did all go into the city at the time, and they were there at the time of Nigel Lawson's Big Bang, and then became, members of the richest elite Britain has ever known, far, far richer than, in terms of gap from the ordinary Britain compared with 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So greed, arrogance, entitlement, privilege, there's something going on there which isn't easily explained, and I'm not sure is unique to Britain. Our class system is kind of unique because of the way money and bloodlines are connected, but I don't know. My mind is still open.
And with that, we take a quick pause today to bring Monumental to your attention. Monumental is a personal and professional development platform tailored for men in their professional prime that I founded a few years ago. We're dedicated to igniting purpose, nurturing wisdom, enabling you to craft a legacy that stands the test of time. Our programs are unparalleled in the leadership development space, offering content that truly transforms lives, backed by a commitment to confidentiality that sets us apart. Explore more at monumental.global or take a scorecard in the description below. Now, let's get back to the conversation. I lived in Asia for a bit, and in Singapore, where they, in terms of their success and why they've been so successful, a lot of people say it's because they pay the ministers and the government ministers. Bankers get paid. So as a result, you get the best brains going over there, as opposed to just thinking straight out of university. Oh, well, if I go and work as a civil servant and get paid, in the 20s, as opposed to going to work for the lawyers and the bankers of this world, and straight out of university, some are now being paid six figures. This astonishing amount of money, especially when you've got debt to pay off. So I think there's that element of how it's happened. But I also now deal with a lot of men in their 40s and 50s, and they come to realize that they're dealing with that decision they made when they were 22, that they went into it, saw the bright lights of the city, were sold a dream by probably their dad's friends or whatever about how good it can be, and are now dealing with that word purpose, and are dealing with the word legacy, and thinking of that question of, is this really the sum total of my life?
Yeah, which is kind of ironic, isn't it? I think my dad's point about you use this privilege in order to better the world or to serve your less fortunate fellows. He wasn't exaggerating. It is very clear, particularly in the sort of the Christian ethos of the 19th century boarding schools, which obviously flows down. Somehow the losing of that, it has more than social consequences. If you wanted to put your finger on something that is something really significant about the education we went through and its gaps, its failings, and it is obviously that if you educate children with a sense that mounting the hierarchy is, the bet you talked about, only your disappointment is only being vice captain, not captain, where the answer to that is quite kind of obvious, enjoy being in the team or enjoy being vice captain. But and you educate children without any measure of success other than financial gain or getting to the top of the stack, you're kind of quite likely to end up with some pretty unhappy people who go, I've climbed Everest, what's beyond that? I've got enough money, and what's further than that? It is a disconnect, and it does make me think, there was some kind of fracture in the ethos of these systems for educating the elite. And it's very clear from what you read about how headmasters lectured children, from the 19th century onwards, is that the purpose was to use this education to better the world, better the human beings around you who are less fortunate. And somehow we do appear to have, and really, I hate generalizing about this, you can see, but there does appear to have been a loss of that. And my son, who was a day boy at an eminent boarding school in Scotland, he left, and I was going, what do you want to do? He's going to make as much money as possible. What else is there? And I was going, I'm not sure that many people leaving school when I did, just as posh schools, would have put it quite so crudely as he did. He's grown up a bit now. He's doing something rather wise and helpful and making some money. But your friends who sitting in their nice houses in Wiltshire or in their holiday homes in the south of France, the answers are quite obvious, aren't they, if they want to improve their lives and their happiness?
Yeah, to me, it's all about connection. It's all about actually starting to talk about it. It may be obvious, but if those are just thoughts spinning around their heads as individuals, nothing will ever happen. So that's why I invite people to come into our group and start talking about it, because then the possibilities of leading a more purposeful life start to appear. And I'm not pigeonholing, giving a generic broad brush across what their family structures are. But if you're into your 40s or your 50s, you have been living a life potentially with a wife who's very used to a certain standard of living, with a family and kids who are used to a very set standard of living. And this word purpose almost has got a bad brand, because it's almost like, well, if you do something purposeful, you're not going to be able to earn enough money and to keep that lifestyle going.
Yeah.
Whereas I come at it from the other way. There are so many problems in this world that need solutions that can be paid for. It just is that we've got this brand that most people, the only way to make enough money is to be in professional services in London or take huge risks, entrepreneurial risks. And I think there's a more nuance to it.
I'm sure there's more nuance to it. The unhappy wealthy that's like the worrying well. What a sad cohort of humanity. But we all know it's a real problem. It's not just about being ignorant and greedy. I think, because of 10 years of being on the receiving end of people's stories, not just about their schools, but about their life after their schools. So I can see clear patterns and clear ways forward. A lot of people come to me and they've never told anyone about what happened at school, and they've been in denial about it because that's the easiest way to deal with it forever. And now they want to address it. And one of the key moments, because they haven't done this, and sometimes I'm lucky enough to hear from them through the process, is talking to the family, talking to the wife. Mm-hmm. And discovering things, the great relief of the way, there are lots of women involved here as well, talking to the spouse. The great relief of realizing that a lot of assumptions about what you had to be in order to keep the spouse on board, or it wasn't what they wanted or needed, or what they actually needed was you to be happy and you to stop hiding what these problems were that made you angry or made you drink or made you not trust love. So it starts with that. And then what you kind of see is when people go through this process, it's a fantastically relieving process of sort of washing away all these stupid assumptions which come from the harm done to us. It is then how kind of easy it then is to find purpose. Because I get involved with a lot of survivors groups from schools, help them by connecting them with other people from the schools and then telling them how you go to the police, and also helping them to find the right therapy, not the wrong therapy. And there's a lot of wrong therapy around. Then when they've been through that sort of disclosure, that we tried to get the guy arrested, we got an apology from the school, all that, we're suing the school, the excitement and the adrenaline of that, then this newfound energy, trying to channel it somewhere good. And that's quite easy to do. There's a load of ideas. A lot of people go from this into going, well, if are children safe at these schools today? Are they safe in state care today? How can I campaign to make that happen? There's literally a bill going through Parliament at the moment, which boarding school survivors are lobbying about. And then into, other campaigning charitable things. Use the stuff the boarding school did give you. The networks, the confidence, the ability, the language skills, the accounting skills, to achieve change and feel good. Everyone uses charity to buy good feelings. It works, you give money to a tramp, you feel a little bit better from it. Try doing it in a consistent long-term way. But in many ways, it starts with liberating yourself from those structures that you applied to around your persona to protect yourself as a suffering child and neglected child at boarding school.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way that you put that. Once I opened up about my experience, I just felt as though everyone else around me opened up, and I realized, it's actually not that scary, and it's quite a massive relief when we can just be ourselves rather than not carrying around the various different masks that we placed on ourselves at such a young and delicate age.
Yeah.
It's then, it's a relief to be able to take them off and just to be ourselves and say, actually, it could be, I actually don't enjoy this job at age 50, even though I'm supposed to retire in 6 years' time, and I'm going to go off and do something else. It may be, like you just said, it may not have to be as big a deal as that to find purpose. It may be, setting up a charity or just supporting a charity or whatever it is, but to get out of that self-fulfilling hole of my time is so important because I've got to make as much money as possible, which is so many people have fallen down that hole. And it begins to feel very empty and lonely and isolating. And I think being married to an American is definitely a different experience, because they just grow up with therapy being a norm. And the therapy thing has almost got a stigma of there's something wrong with you. It's just part of the human experience to be able to talk. It's just that I find a lot of men from maybe our background have had that literally ripped out of them at such a young age, is that it just isn't normality. So they feel that they have to go and get therapy to be right, which almost pigeonholes them in this sort of area of there's something wrong with them, where it's just that they're not necessarily something wrong. It's just that you just need to talk more and you will feel better.
It's interesting because I think, even in just the 10 years that I've been involved in this field, which is essentially addressing complex childhood trauma and its long-term effects, things have shifted really fast then. Get a huge post back. The average person is going, here you have a database. This happened at my school. I just wanted to see if anything else happened. And I send them back a standard thing going, well, I'll log the details in confidence. And if you like, I connect you to others. And going to police is not a bad idea, but for goodness sake, get some therapy first. 10 years ago, when I was first sending out those pretty standardized letters, the pushback was, oh, no, or I tried it, it was nonsense, or, there's nothing wrong with me. I don't get that pushback anymore. I mean, people know that is the answer because people understand PTSD and understand that childhood experiences do form what happens for the rest. And a sort of, there's much more, I mean, many people will decry it, but there's a much better, more healthy culture of self-observation. It's really kind of rare now, even in my age group, for people to deny that. There's just so many great stories. People who really did liberate themselves from their past just by opening up about it and coming to an understanding of it. There is something wrong with many of us who were sent away from home too young and not loved.
Yeah, well,
literally, we have a damage and we can do things about it. And it should be seen in the same light as having, fractured your leg and needing to act on it.
I think when I say there's something not wrong, my interpretation is you may not be externally be coming across as though there's something wrong. People may not feel as though there's something wrong with you. So you may be telling yourself that there's nothing going on and you can just sort of sit in that denial center. So many people are, and there are probably people listening to this going, yeah, well, there's not, I'm living an all right life. Why do I need to go why do I need to go into it? Why do I need to go searching for something that's wrong? And for me, it's not about going to search the trauma or search what's going on. It's about just actually sort of liberating more space in your own minds for more joy, for more peace. And that's always possible in all of us.
Liberation is a really good way to put it. There's lots of metaphors, aren't there? I mean, you have to tidy up the attic and sort out your office in order to start afresh and get more going on. It doesn't mean abandoning, your world. It just means being open to development.
Yeah. And I mean, we've seen this pretty publicly lately, haven't we, with Charles Spencer and you working with Nikki Campbell.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that.
People get in touch with me and log the details of what happened to them at school. And I've got this massive spreadsheet, which is 1,300 serious allegations against teachers. But those are criminal allegations. But what tends often to happen with that is a process that begins, which is just people going, I just feel so much better now I've spoken to you. And then I feel so much better now I hear 2 other people have written to me about Mr. Smithers and his. But some of them, they track down the pervert. They get police involved, and that can be very satisfying. And revenge is good therapy. Actually, I'm not a shrink, but it has its purposes. But it can also be incredibly re-triggering and frustrating. And you may end up. I've known lots of people who've ended up in court with 2 psychiatrists arguing over why they've had mental health problems. One psychiatrist is going, well, it's obviously because of what happened to him at this school. And the other's going, well, but he appears to have been a fuck up in his 20s as well. Or his partner died. Or, so you can have all sorts of really ill effects. Yeah. But generally, there's a huge satisfaction in people getting the adults to listen at last. For me, when I finally went to the police, aged 55 or whatever, in support of the others from my school. But I had to make a statement about the 2 teachers who sexually assaulted me. And it was one of the most liberating moments of my life, because a grown-up was listening to and taking me seriously. So all those processes are fascinating and liberating, the word we're using. The Nicky Campbell thing has been... So this starts, and for those who don't know, I did a radio series in which we wanted to track how the schools, and we singled out some very famous schools, had known about paedophile teachers, and then instead of bringing the police, had got rid of them when the noise became too much, and basically given them references and allowed them to go on to other schools. So there are teachers from my school, Ashdown House, and from Eton, who could have been stopped in the 1970s, but went on abusing children into the 2000s. And this is what makes me and others really angry. It's less the sickos who tried to put hands down children's shorts, but the adults, the grand headmasters and governors who covered it up and put more children at risk. So we did this radio series, and we mentioned this teacher who taught at Fettes in Edinburgh Academy, though everyone knew he was a violent pervert. And then Nicky Campbell, the radio current affairs presenter, picked it up because he realized that this was the man who'd assaulted his friends. And then as a result of that, loads more people came through. And by the end of it, I have a list of 29 names of adult staff at Edinburgh Academy School who over 30 years are accused of, and there are going to be 5 more prosecutions. And there's another guy they're trying to extradite from South Africa. And this exposed something enormous. But what was really remarkable is how that group, and it's probably over 100 people now, who were encouraged by Campbell to come forward and talk about it. And Campbell never had. That it was all right to do it. The way they bonded, the way they've helped each other and shared and supported the community that they've made 55 years later, all men in their early 60s, late 60s, the way they've used that positive energy, not just to track down the villains and get compensation payments, which is pretty good too, but also, a load of them are raising money for the NSPCC now by climbing Everest. And it does show that there's a new life and another way to be. And they're reaching out, they're campaigning to make sure the government brings in better safety checks in schools and care homes today. It's been really rich to see. And I've seen survivors groups absolutely break up because there's a lot of chaotic, overeducated alpha males in them, and they haven't worked, but this one really has. And it's been a lesson that, men in their 50s and 60s can change. Completely change. And some things you see in the successful survivors groups is people going forward saying, I know I bullied you really badly when you were 30, and I know I made your life a misery. I really want to say I'm sorry.
That's amazing.
Those things work. They help. Really moving, actually. I'm pretty down on middle-aged men like myself. I think we're boring, grumpy, bald. We don't know how to listen to other people. We just tell anecdotes all the time. We bang on, and our minds are set in a different age, before mobile phones, when things were better or whatever. But I'm seeing men change dramatically, and everyone around them is happier. Their children, their wives. It's remarkable. You're not stuck, even when you're bald and wrinkly. You can still move on.
It makes my heart warm when I hear of stories like that, because, it really is never too late. My mum's still doing personal development work, and she's in her mid-70s. She's amazing. And she's been with me on my journey over the last 10 years and has just been so positive about it.
My mother has, after initially being really cross that I was breaking all this stuff up in public. But actually, it's been important to, and my siblings, who all went to boarding school as well. Because mum didn't listen. She knew we were unhappy at school, and she thought that was how it had to be. That was necessary.
Right.
And she now realizes that was wrong. But it's changed our relationship too.
Well, 100%. As you said earlier about being angry, I think that is whatever the 5 stages of grief. And this is a bit of mourning a childhood that for many was lost. that second stage of grief is, well, the first stage being denial, the second stage being anger. And I think that a lot of guys I've spoken to go through that angry stage to their parents, whether they're alive or not alive. But it's something that needs to dissipate to allow the healing to come through, because ultimately they are just humans like me and you are. And they were just trying to do the best for the children that they loved. It weren't necessarily aware of what was going on, and it was just the done thing. There's no point really holding on to that anger. It's actually just damaging.
No, but I think making peace with, if you begin to understand there is residual anger against your parents or your mother in particular, that is really important, because I think a lot of us, have had trouble with relationships and with women particularly in later life, because we didn't really trust love. Yeah. And having the key woman neglect us then, it's very hard to admit it, but will cause trouble in your relationships going on. So making peace with your mother, I'm sure, has made my other relationships, including with my wife, better.
It's the sort of this phrase of class traitor, Charles Spencer's sort of brought up over the last few months, particularly, and it almost sounds a bit like being a family traitor as well, and I felt that coming out the way that I did, and just saying, look, my exterior may be all very glossy, but I tell you what, it's been an absolute shit fight for the last 10 years trying to work all this out. And I did feel, and I said to my parents, before I did that, I said, look, in order to free myself and to have a happy life, I've got to start talking about this. There's just no way I can actually keep this bottled up. You came out, obviously, with your platform, in a very, very public way. Did you feel, or get made to feel by anyone, as a sort of class traitor, family traitor?
Oh, very much. In fact, there's quite a famous journalist who's sort of a friend called me a class traitor. And I went, can I put that on the paperback of the book? You had to embrace that. No, I had some really bizarre reaction. I was very, very nervous when I first came out. And you know why? It's not just the public exposure, but also because I was trained from 8 years old not to talk, not to speak. I remember my entire dormitory being punished by the headmaster after our first term. Someone in the holidays had told their parents how miserable they were. And we were all called in, and we were all kind of going, this is great. The dormitory head is going to be caned because he's been bullying us so much. And it wasn't. We were all punished for talking to our parents. So anyway, disclosing publicly is a really problematic thing, because a lot of you, deep in your bones are going, don't do, this is not what we do. And it's also egotistical, arrogant, narcissistic, perhaps. I remember I was at an art gallery opening a week after I had this big article in one of the Sunday magazines. And my wife and I all knew everyone was talking about it, but no one was talking about it to me. And we were standing around with, sort of fairly, not mates, but people we knew, as you do with a glass of wine in your hand. And this guy, this old Etonian who I know, standing next to me, said, don't stand too close to Alex. He might put his hand down your shorts, which is literally what I described in the paper, the teacher doing to me. And everyone I went, sort of moved away. That was kind of shocking. But I mean,
in that moment, how did that make you feel?
Sick. Bullied. Ashamed. And what a great story.
Right.
I literally went out and I this is before Twitter, but I literally told everybody about that reaction.
Yeah.
Because also knowing him, he was horribly bullied at school. Not by me, luckily. He's a bit younger than me, 3 years younger than me, but he really was appallingly bullied at Eton.
Often the case.
That's your problem, mate.
Often
but I have seen him since, and I've never mentioned it. I've written about it in print, and I haven't named him, but I've literally, not long ago, I spent a day with him, just by chance, and I never brought it up. And my wife was going, "Why don't you bring it up?" I was going, I can't really be bothered. I mean, it's poor him. I think you end up thinking, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah. That's the evolutionary healing the cycle, isn't it?
But I think, there is an egotism in coming out, and it can be dangerous. I mean, I think people can end up very unhappy. I mean, people who come to me seeking media attention, or journalists who come to me looking for survivors of a particular institution, I do help that happen. I say to survivors, don't identify yourself. Preserve your anonymity. Whatever stuff will happen which you may really not want. I've been all right, but there is a tendency, an urge. I say, right, okay, I'm going to open up about this. I'm going to open up about everything and my name, everything else. It's not necessary. You don't owe it, and I think it can be unwise. And he's very careful thinking about it.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for talking to us today. If people would like to hear more about you and read more about your research and your books, etc., how would they contact you?
Well, I've got a site, alexrenton.com, that has a contact page on it, and I do still keep my database of complaints, in confidence, and if you want to write to me, for that, or to see if there's anything relevant on that to your school experience, please do. I may take a little while getting back to you. It's a very full inbox.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Pete. I enjoyed it.
So thank you for joining me, Pete Hunt, on the Privileged Man podcast. If you're interested in learning more about our personal and professional development platform for men in their professional prime, please visit the website monumental.global for more details.